I thank the gentleman. Gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Bishop.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Turley, I saw the effort to discredit you by a member on the other side sort of go down in flames. I don't think much else needs to be said about that. But, you know, I think what is interesting about what you've written and then in your testimony about the Twitter files and your tentative conclusion about what they may indicate is a product. First, it bears repeating. I mean, you said there that it, quote, could well constitute the largest censorship program ever run by the government of the United States. And I think what attracts you is there is a body of evidence. It is not accusations, it is evidence that we would not have but for the voluntary, it may be extraordinarily unlikely, voluntary act of a very wealthy American who had the will and interest to purchase that company and then disclose what its files hold. Here's what's notable. We didn't get any information about what the FBI and the CIA and the ODNI and GEC and all these other agencies are engaged in from those agencies. The American people wouldn't know but for Elon Musk's disclosures and the independent journalists who then used them. You've talked a little bit in response to earlier questions about how there might be enough evidence there, or in other evidence we might be able to get of a like kind, to suggest an agency relationship between United States government agencies, the FBI, and these social media platforms that would cross the First Amendment line and violate the rights of Americans whose content was flagged for taken down. And that may well be, but it seems to me there's another angle to this. Everybody knows in the debate over big tech that these social media platforms have content moderation policies that are narrower than the First Amendment. They take down speech as a matter of practice that the First Amendment would protect if it were a government. In fact, a lot of people say, well, they can do that, they're private businesses. The question that gets at me is this: how could the FBI, which is sworn to protect the Constitution, ever justify using intense application of its resources, agents, etc., to urge social media platforms to use those standards to take down speech that the Constitution protects?
Yeah, this goes to the sort of bifurcated issue here legally. That is, you have on one hand the question of the agency relationship, which actually some courts like the Eighth Circuit and Dawson, the Sixth Circuit and Page have had analogous cases where they said that there was an agency when a government official made a call and negative actions were taken. But there's also the direct action. Obviously, federal agents are government actors. And in these cases, you have the agency identifying American citizens and others for their viewpoints and saying, we think these people should be suspended or removed. And as I say in my testimony, it's a particularly ominous thing to have the chief law enforcement agency performing this role, an agency with incredible powers. But this wasn't the normal situation of a public affairs office where someone says, look, the FBI did this, and the public affairs office says, you know what, that was a state raid. We weren't even in that issue.
They did it in private.
Right, here you had the government itself looking for citizens who should be silenced and targeted. That's a problem in and of itself, whether it also triggers an agency relationship. Do we want to go back to the day when governments created those types of lists?
Let me get you to comment on something else that I believe is ominous. It's on the charts behind me. One of the Twitter file disclosures is that Elvis Chan at the FBI San Francisco wrote to a Twitter executive and said, my colleagues at the fort had a query for you. Turns out they had to tell me that means Fort Meade, the National Security Agency, NSA, probably. A few years ago, Twitter said they would no longer provide their data feed to members of the IC. That means intelligence community. And he goes on to ask whether colleagues at the NSA want to know if they'd reconsider that, because the NSA would like to vacuum up every word mentioned on Twitter by American citizens to be analyzed by computers to figure out what they would make of it. What about that? You don't comment on that in your column, but I'm curious what your impression is of that.
Well, that's another troubling aspect of this interstitial relationship between the government and social media companies. Now, on some occasions, the social media companies said, we're not going to do that. But all these different layers of interaction that the Twitter files refer to make it harder and harder to discern where the government ends and the social media company begins. And I want to emphasize that when I talk about the largest censorship system in history, that is really unquestionable, right? I mean, even Twitter alone is a massive censorship system. When you combine the other companies, now it is privately run, and now we're looking at how much of that was being directed or influenced by the United States government. But we are, without question, talking about the world's largest censorship system. And when you add elements like the one that you talked about, of this sort of interstitial relationship or cross-pollination between agencies and social media, it becomes a very menacing prospect. These companies are enormously powerful. They control much of our political speech. And as we talk about the dangers to democracy, and I agree with many of the Democratic members and the Republican members about the need to protect our democracy, that's a threat to democracy. When you have the ability of people to speak and control of companies that are using standards that are really undiscernible. Yesterday, when we heard the testimony of one of the Twitter executives, she gave a standard for which they would decide what could be censored. I wrote about it today on the blog. That standard defies definition. And I will simply say that the greatest danger of the First Amendment is the chilling effect, the unknown of when you will be targeted.
I regret my time's expired, Mr. Chairman.